From favorite Father Brown stories, The Salad of Colonel Cray. Father Brown was walking home from Mass on a white, weird morning when the mists were slowly lifting. One of those mornings when the very element of light appears as something mysterious and new. The scattered trees outlined themselves more and more out of the vapor, as if they were first drawn in gray chalk and then in charcoal. At yet more distant intervals appeared the houses upon the broken fringe of the suburb. Their outlines became clearer and clearer until he recognized many in which he had chance acquaintances, and many more the names of whose owners he knew. But all the windows and doors were sealed. None of the people were of the sort that would be up at such a time, or still less on such an errand. But as he passed under the shadow of one handsome villa with verandas and wide ornate gardens, he heard a noise that made him almost involuntarily stop. It was the unmistakable noise of a pistol or carbine or some light firearm discharged. But it was not this that puzzled him most. The first full noise was immediately followed by a series of fainter noises, as he counted them, about 6. He supposed it must be the echo, but the odd thing was that the echo was not in the least like the original sound. It was not like anything else that he could think of. The three things nearest to it seemed to be the noise made by siphons of soda water, one of the many noises made by an animal, and the noise made by a person attempting to conceal laughter, none of which seemed to make much sense. Father Brown was made of 2 men. There was a man of action, who was as modest as a primrose and as punctual as a clock, who went his small round of duties and never dreamed of altering it. There was also a man of reflection, who was much simpler but much stronger, who could not easily be stopped, whose thought was always, in the only intelligent sense of the words, free thought. He could not help, even unconsciously, asking himself all the questions that there were to be asked, and answering as many of them as he could, all that went on like his breathing or circulation. But he never consciously carried his actions outside the sphere of his own duty, and in this case the 2 attitudes were aptly tested. He was just about to resume his trudge in the twilight, telling himself it was no affair of his, but instinctively twisting and untwisting 20 theories about what the odd noises might mean. Then the gray skyline brightened into silver, and in the broadening light he realized that he had been to the house which belonged to an Anglo-Indian major named Putnam, and that the major had a native cook from Malta, who was of his communion. He also began to remember that pistol shots were sometimes serious things, accompanied with consequences with which he was legitimately concerned. He turned his back and went in at the garden gate, making for the front door. Halfway down one side of the house stood out a projection like a very low shed. It was, as he afterwards discovered, a large dustbin. Round the corner of this came a figure, at first a mere shadow in the haze, apparently bending and peering about. Then coming nearer, it solidified into a figure that was, indeed, rather unusually solid. Major Putnam was a bald-headed, bull-necked man, short and very broad, with one of those rather apoplectic faces that are produced by a prolonged attempt to combine the Oriental climate with the Occidental luxuries. But the face was a good-humored one, and even now, though evidently puzzled and inquisitive, wore a kind of innocent grin. He had a large palm-leaf hat on the back of his head, suggesting a halo that was by no means appropriate to the face. But otherwise he was clad only in a very vivid suit of striped scarlet and yellow pajamas, which, though glowing enough to behold, must have been, on a fresh morning, pretty chilly to wear. He had evidently come out of his house in a hurry, and the priest was not surprised when he called out without further ceremony, "Did you hear that noise?" "Yes," answered Father Brown. "I thought I'd better look in case anything was the matter." The major looked at him rather queerly with his good-humored gooseberry eyes. "What do you think the noise was?" he asked. "It sounded like a gun or something," replied the other with some hesitation, "but it seemed to have a singular sort of echo." The major was still looking at him quietly, but with protruding eyes, when the front door was flung open, releasing a flood of gaslight on the face of the fading mist, and another figure in pajamas sprang or tumbled out into the garden. The figure was much longer, leaner, and more athletic. The pajamas, though equally tropical, were comparatively tasteful, being of white with a light lemon-yellow stripe. The man was haggard but handsome, more sunburned than the other. He had an aquiline profile and rather deep sunken eyes, and a slight air of oddity arising from the combination of coal-black hair with a much lighter mustache. All this Father Brown absorbed in detail more at leisure. For the moment he only saw one thing about the man, which was the revolver in his hand. "Cray!" exclaimed the major, staring at him. "Did you fire that shot?" "Yes, I did," retorted the black-haired gentleman hotly, "and so would you in my place. If you were chased everywhere by devils and nearly—" The major seemed to intervene rather hurriedly. "This is my friend, Father Brown," he said. And then to Brown, "I don't know whether you've met Colonel Cray of the Royal Artillery." "I've heard of him, of course," said the priest innocently. Did you hit anything?" "I thought so," answered Cray with gravity. "Did he," asked Major Putnam in a lowered voice, "did he fall or cry out or anything?" Colonel Cray was regarding his host with a strange and steady stare. "I'll tell you exactly what he did," he said. "He sneezed." Father Brown's hand went halfway up his head with the gesture of a man remembering somebody's name. He knew now what it was that was neither soda water nor the snort of a dog. "Well," ejaculated the staring major, "I never heard before that a service revolver was a thing to be sneezed at." "Nor I," said Father Brown faintly. "It's lucky you didn't turn your artillery on him, or you might have given him quite a bad cold." Then, after a bewildered pause, he said, "Was it a burglar?" "Let us go inside," said Major Putnam rather sharply, and led the way into his house. The interior exhibited a paradox often to be marked in such morning houses, that the rooms seemed brighter than the sky outside, even after the major had turned out the one gas light in the front hall. Father Brown was surprised to see the whole dining table set out as for a festive meal, with the napkins in their rings and wine glasses of some 6 unnecessary shapes set beside every plate. It was common enough at that time of the morning to find the remains of a banquet overnight, but to find it freshly spread so early was unusual. When he stood wavering in the hall, Major Putnam rushed past him and sent a raging eye over the whole oblong of the tablecloth. At last he spoke, spluttering. "All the silver gone!" he gasped. "Fish knives and forks gone! Old cruet stand gone! Even old silver cream jug gone! And now, Father Brown, I'm ready to answer your question of whether it was a burglar." "They're simply a blind," said Cray stubbornly. "I know better than you why people persecute this house. I know better than you why—" The major patted him on the shoulder with a gesture almost peculiar to the soothing of a sick child, and said, "It was a burglar. Obviously, it was a burglar." "A burglar with a bad cold," observed Father Brown. "That might assist you to trace him in the neighborhood." The major shook his head in a somber manner. "He must be far beyond tracing now, I fear," he said. Then, as the restless man with the revolver turned again toward the door into the garden, he added in a husky, confidential voice, "I doubt whether I should send for the police, for fear my friend here has been a little too free with his bullets and got on the wrong side of the law. He's lived in very wild places, and to be frank with you, I think he sometimes fancies things." "I think you once told me," said Brown, "that he believes some Indian secret society is pursuing him." Major Putnam nodded, but but at the same time shrugged his shoulders. "I suppose we'd better follow him outside," he said. "I don't want any more, shall we say, sneezing." They passed out into the morning light, which was now even tinged with sunshine, and saw Colonel Cray's tall figure bent almost double, minutely examining the condition of gravel and grass. While the major strolled unobtrusively towards him, the priest took an equally indolent turn, which took him round the next corner of the house to within a yard or two of the projecting dustbin. He stood regarding this dismal object for some minute and a half. Then he stepped toward it, lifted the lid, and put his head inside. Dust and other discoloring matter shook upward as he did so, but Father Brown never observed his own appearance, whatever else he observed. He remained thus for a measurable period, as if engaged in some mysterious prayers. Then he came out again with some ashes on his hair and walked unconcernedly away. By the time he came round to the garden door again, he found a group there, which seemed to roll away morbidities, as the sunlight had already rolled away the mists. It was in no way rationally reassuring. It was simply broadly comic, like a cluster of Dickens characters. Major Putnam had managed to slip inside and plunge into a proper shirt and trousers, with a crimson cummerbund, and a light square jacket over all. Thus, normally set off, his red, festive face seemed bursting with a commonplace cordiality. He was indeed emphatic, but then he was talking to his cook, the swarthy son of Malta, whose lean, yellow, and rather careworn face contrasted quaintly with his snow-white cap and costume. The cook might well be careworn, for cookery was the major's hobby. He was one of those amateurs who always know more than the professional. The only other person he even admitted to be a judge of an omelet was his friend Cray, and as Brown remembered this, he turned to look for the other officer. In the new presence of daylight and people clothed in their right mind, the sight of him was rather a shock. The taller and more elegant man was still in his night garb, with tousled black hair, and now crawling about the garden on his hands and knees, still looking for traces of the burglar, and now and again, to all appearance, striking the ground with his hand in anger at not finding him. Seeing him thus quadrupedal in the grass, the priest raised his eyebrows rather sadly, and for the first time guessed that fancy things might be a euphemism. The third item in the group of the cook and the epicure was also known to Father Brown. It was Audrey Watson, the major's ward and housekeeper, and at this moment, to judge by her apron, tucked up sleeves, and resolute manner, much more the housekeeper than the ward. "It serves you right," she was saying. "I always told you not to have that old-fashioned cruet stand." "I prefer it," said Putnam placably. "I'm old-fashioned myself, and the things keep together." "And vanish together, as you see," she retorted. "Well, if you're not going to bother about the burglar, I shouldn't bother about the lunch. It's Sunday, and we can't send for vinegar and all that in the town, and you Indian gentlemen can't enjoy what you call a dinner without a lot of hot things. I wish to goodness, now, you hadn't asked Cousin Oliver to take me to the musical service. It isn't over till 12:30, and the colonel has to leave by then. I don't believe you men can manage alone." "Oh, yes, we can, my dear," said the major, looking at her very amiably. "Marco has all the sauces, and we've often done ourselves well in very rough places, as you might know by now. And it's time you had a treat, Audrey. You mustn't be a housekeeper every hour of the day, and you know I want to hear the music." "I want to go to church," she said, with rather severe eyes. She was one of those handsome women who will always be handsome, because the beauty is not in an air or tent, but in the very structure of the head and features. But though she was not yet middle-aged, and her auburn hair was of the tight-nest fullness in form and color, there was a look in her mouth and around her eyes which suggested that some sorrows wasted her, as winds waste at last the edges of a Greek temple. For indeed, the little domestic difficulties of which she was now speaking so decisively was rather comic than tragic. Father Brown gathered from the course of the conversation that Cray, the other gourmet, had to leave before the usual lunchtime, but that Putnam, his host, not to be done out of a final feast with his old crony, had arranged for a special déjeuner to be set out and consumed in the course of the morning, while Audrey and the other graver persons were at morning service. She was going there under the escort of a relative and old friend of hers, Dr. Oliver Oman, who, though a scientific man of somewhat bitter type, was enthusiastic for music and would go even to church to get it. There was nothing in all this world that could conceivably concern the tragedy in Miss Watson's face, and by a half-conscious instinct, Father Brown turned again to the seeming lunatic grubbing about in the grass. And I think we'll pause here, and we'll continue with this story in the next video. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. I love you guys. As Tigger says, ta-ta for now.